Welcome back to Native Exiles, Alderwood Community Church's podcast, where we talk about following Jesus in the tension of being in the world but not of it. And we're talking about one particular aspect today about what it is like to be an exile, to be in the world but not of it, and that is being willing to act and speak and live in a way that may very well cause the condemnation of those around you, that, you know, will have people look down on you. And this is the topic of being bold, of living in a way that that doesn't care whether people are going to respond negatively to you or not. And we get into the kind of the positive of that and the negative of that. I think it's a great conversation. Let's jump in. Well, Steve, this is episode number 10. That makes you a seasoned podcast host.
This has been a lot of fun. I'm enjoying it a lot.
Yeah, I'm too. We have one today that, quite honestly, I kind of wanted to avoid, but there's no avoiding it. And the fact that I want to avoid it means that we probably should be talking about it. We are talking about boldness today.
Yeah, I have almost a visceral reaction to the word. I mean, as we've been talking about it recently, and they're mostly negative, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, you and I both grew up in the church, and yeah, that visceral reaction, that kind of the memory that I have when I think about boldness, I just think about, you know, the kind of high pressure, high guilt sermon about essentially never being on an airplane without sharing the gospel with the person who's sitting next to you. And by the way, nothing wrong with sharing the gospel with people. I've actually done that several times, and sometimes that's awesome. But
sometimes the person looks at you like, please, I just want to enjoy my flight and put my headphones in.
Well, I mean, the pressure was so big, you know, sometimes you sit down on a flight and the person next to you just immediately has headphones on. And it's like, what am I supposed to do? Like snap in front of their face and say, hey, can you take those off for a second so I can tell you about Jesus?
Knock on their headphones.
So there is this kind of history of evangelicalism where maybe we've gotten a little off track on boldness, but it is a super biblical concept and idea. One that our church is studying the book of Daniel right now is actually all over the place in the book of Daniel.
Yeah, it's huge. And before we go to Daniel, can I just say for a minute, there's one other aspect of the negative reaction for me, which is my personality. Mm-hmm. Like, if you tell me to be bold, that's like saying, Steve, try to be ridiculously good looking. I mean, that can't happen.
So some of it is just personality and temperament.
I avoid conflict. I do not like being in uncomfortable situations or making other people feel uncomfortable. So that's my connotations.
Well, man, and you talk to introverts in the church, and a lot of them feel over the years like the church just assumes everybody's extroverted. You know, all the examples are about talking to your neighbors. All the examples are about being outgoing. And so there is absolutely an aspect where for some people we're more naturally wired for boldness. For others we're not. That's okay. God wired us differently. So that's not going to be the takeaway, is change your personality. There is another reason too that I think I have this visceral reaction is our culture right now, I think, has overdone it on boldness in a lot of ways. I'm not even talking about sharing the gospel or evangelism. I'm talking
just
about
general American culture.
I mean, you know, social media has given everybody a soapbox to talk about their opinions on any topic.
Right.
And people aren't shy about that. And some people, you know, I think it actually is a small minority of people who are just the loudest. But, you know, we've been through some divisive times politically. We've gone through COVID times, and everybody has opinions on masking and vaccines and whatever. And sometimes it just feels like everybody in our entire society is yelling at each other all the time. And so as a pastor, to encourage boldness, I think sometimes feels like malpractice.
A little scary. I mean, it's almost like on our social media, you know, the mood is, we're contradictory too. We're like very bold about telling other people to stop being bold. Yeah. So, I mean, we're in this sort of conundrum right now where everybody's maybe a little bit down on the idea.
So we're going to see if we can cut through some of the social expectations, some of kind of the baggage that comes out of my church history, and get into what does the Bible say about boldness? What is the example we have, and what does that look like today? And we'll start with the book of Daniel, which is where we've been in the church, in just a second. So the reason why this topic matters so much as we think about being exiles is because boldness is one of those things you have to have if you're going to live differently than the culture around you. And this topic came up as we've been in the book of Daniel as a church, looking at what it looks like to live as an exile. And there's a number of situations that happen in that book with Daniel, with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, where they have to be bold. They have to act in a way where they're willing to take the scorn of the people around them, put their lives on the line even. Steve, what's been one of the examples from our series that stood out to you in that regard?
I mean, these are like the iconic Sunday school stories, that you grow up with as a kid. I think the one that we saw with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is my favorite, where they refuse to bow down to the idol. And then when they get the chance to, change their minds, they say, whatever happens, whether we die or not, we're going to stand for the Lord. Yeah. And that, it's just, but it's so confident. It's not in your face. It's bold in the best sense of the word.
It is, I am going to be faithful to God. I'm going to stand up for what I believe in. It does not matter what you think of that. Even though you have power, even though you can throw me into the furnace, it's not going to sway me or change my mind. I've made up my mind. I'm going to stay faithful. And so, that is one of those examples. We're teaching at a Day on the Lion's Den this Sunday, which is another one. What I love about that one is it would have been so easy for Daniel to not be thrown in the lion's den. For people who aren't familiar with the story, King Darius issues a decree that nobody can pray to anybody but him. And if anybody does, they'll be thrown to the lion's den. And it says in verse 10 of chapter 6, when Daniel heard that, he immediately went to the upper room of his house where the windows opened and faced Jerusalem, and he prayed 3 times a day. So it's like all he had to do was just close the windows. He didn't have to even stop praying. Praying can happen inside of your own head. You don't even have to speak out loud. He could have privately prayed. He could have, hid, no problem, but he didn't. He boldly, openly said, I actually want people to see me. I want people to see that I am still faithful to God, that this isn't going to sway me. Like that's boldness in my mind.
It's interesting you said earlier that to live as exiles, you have to be bold. I wonder if in their mind, because the word I don't think is mentioned anywhere in the book. It's exemplified, but I wonder if in their mind they were thinking, okay, we have to be bold, or if it's just a part of maintaining your identity as a follower of the Most High God.
Yeah, I certainly think it had to go through their mind, are we willing to face the consequences of these choices?
Yeah.
I think it was on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's mind that that furnace over there in the corner that's turned up pretty hot, is a place where we might head if we don't bow down, and they make an intentional decision. We're going to take on the consequences of this. So whether they were thinking in terms of boldness or not, they're weighing the pros and cons and saying, it doesn't matter what you throw at me. I'm not going to give up my faithfulness to God.
Yeah. And it's interesting, even as we're talking here, I hadn't thought of this before our podcast, but it's always used as a descriptor in the Bible, even as we're going to move out here into some other scriptures. Like, I don't think generally people go, I'm going to be bold. You're bold when you love something enough to take whatever stand you have to take. Because being bold can be a negative thing too, as I'm sure we're going to talk about here.
Yeah, we'll get into that. Let's keep on the positive for a second, though. Let's get out of Daniel. The New Testament uses the term bold all the time. It's a concept that Jesus uses pretty strongly. One of my favorite passages where Jesus is talking about boldness is where he says in Luke chapter 9, verse 26, whoever is ashamed of me and my words, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his glory and in the glory of the Father and the holy angels. And Jesus doesn't use the word bold there, but it's the concept. He says, if you're timid, if you're ashamed of me, if when people come and talk to you about me, you pretend you don't know who I am, or you won't talk about me or whatever, don't forget, I'm coming back one day and I will be ashamed of you in that moment. And so, he cares about our boldness, it seems like.
That is one of the most sobering scriptures. When I was growing up, I remember that just haunted me. Like, I remember going and shopping one time in the Gap when I was in 10th grade and leaving the Gap feeling horribly guilty, not because of child sweatshops in Indonesia, but because I never shared Christ with anybody in the Gap. I just thought I was just ashamed of Jesus. So how far are we willing to take that? Does that mean every time we interact with somebody, if we don't bring up the gospel, we're ashamed of the gospel?
Well, one thing's clear is that you had a much more tender heart than I had as a kid, because I did a lot of shopping at the mall and never felt bad about it ever.
Guilty?
But yeah, it certainly can be taken too far, but at least the principle is there. Jesus expects you to not be ashamed of him if you're a follower of his, that I mean, he's speaking in the Roman Empire. He knows that in a short time he's going to be crucified. He knows that, his followers are going to be put to death. His expectation is, I expect that you're not going to be ashamed of me, that you're going to boldly own that you follow me, that you know me. You're going to proclaim the gospel even if the stakes are high.
And we know from church history just how seriously early Christians took that, to the point that they were willing to give up their lives. And that's one of the reasons that people looked on and said, wow, if somebody's willing to be that bold and that courageous, I want that.
Yeah. And, one of the great examples that we have in the New Testament of Jesus' followers being bold is the book of Acts. It's the story of Paul as the missionary going from town to town, proclaiming the gospel, being beaten over and over, being stoned and left for dead, getting up, dusting himself off, and going back and preaching the gospel again. I think you got a text to share from Paul that kind of gets at that idea.
Yeah, there's one of my favorite texts comes from Colossians, where Paul is talking to the Colossians about what it means for them to share Christ in their daily lives. And he kind of sets it alongside what it means for him to share Christ. So this is from Colossians 4, starting in verse 2. Devote yourselves to prayer, being watchful and thankful, and pray for us too, that God may open a door for our message so that we may proclaim the mystery of Christ, for which I am in chains. Pray that I may proclaim it clearly, which sounds a lot like another scripture in Ephesians where he says, pray that I may proclaim it boldly, as I should. Be wise in the way you act toward outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. I love that the great apostle Paul asks for prayer to be clear and bold.
Multiple times.
Because I need it. We all need it. And I think it's easy to think that Paul, he just had it down. It came naturally to him.
Well, and kind of to your point earlier, for those of us that aren't naturally wired to be bold, but it's not our personality, it does help you see that it isn't just about there's some people who just are always bold. It's not a problem for them. Even Paul is saying, I need your prayer. This is hard, but I know I need to be bold. Help me, partner with me in praying for that. And that's a good reminder for us too, that even if you are more of a timid person personality wise, it's still a call to get outside of your personality and be bold.
It reminds me a little bit, of the fact that in the church, for instance, there's evangelists, people who are really gifted. Generally, they also have the gift of being bold and confident in what they say. But that doesn't mean the rest of us don't evangelize. So for me, someone who's more of an introvert, doesn't like conflict, uncomfortable situations, that doesn't get me off the hook. When the moment comes, when the season is there, I need to be ready with an answer and not ashamed of the gospel.
Yeah. You may not have the gift of evangelism. We don't all have all the spiritual gifts, but we all are followers of Jesus who have been given the Great Commission to share the gospel to the ends of the earth. And so whether you have the gift or not, it's something that we get to do together. I think it's also important to note what the Bible does not say about boldness, because we were talking a little bit about the timid. There's this other personality type that many people have where you're extroverted. You have strong opinions. You don't mind that people might look down on you. In fact, you kind of like rubbing it in somebody's face if you're right and they're wrong. And it's important to note that as many good examples as we see of boldness, Jesus cares about it, Paul cares about it. It's in a ton of Bible stories. It is not good in every situation. There is bad boldness.
For sure. I was thinking about the word a lot this last week, and in my mind it exists on kind of a spectrum. Like if I put the word bold right in the middle, on one end I'd have words like maybe brash, arrogant, cocky, proud. And on the other end, I'd have words like confident or open or free, good words. There's positives and there's negatives. And brash is the negative side of boldness. And,
boldness is not inherent good. It's not a fruit of the Spirit. It's not something that we all just aspire to for its own sake. What boldness is the willingness to live out your life and your opinions without regard for how people are going to respond for it. Now, if you're acting out of integrity and love for others and faith without regard for how people respond to it, that's awesome. But if you are being an arrogant jerk and being selfish without regard for what people think about it, that's boldly sinning. And the Bible uses those terms. We found one earlier. I mean, in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 10, Peter is condemning the false teachers and the people who have rejected the way of Jesus, and he calls them bold and arrogant. And then he says that they, refuse, or they're even willing to heap abuse onto celestial beings, which we don't have time to get into what that means, but it's not good. And his whole point is like, they're so openly sinful. They're bold in it. They don't care what anybody thinks. And so what we're seeing is that boldness is not inherently good or inherently bad. It's an amplifier. It is being willing to live openly, whatever you're living as. And as followers of Jesus, we want to follow Jesus openly. We want to love people openly without regard for the consequences.
It's like a spiritual food enhancer. It's like MSG. It just amplifies what's
salt.
going on.
There you go.
You know, you said something in your message last week. I'm actually jotting at my notes that really relates to this. You said, in the world, you're going to see pride all over the place. You were talking about pride and humility, and we're all tempted to respond to pride with pride.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things you and I are very concerned with as Christians and as the church is that we do take a bold stance in speaking up for Jesus and the gospel, but we don't become boldly arrogant. And that is something that it is easy to do when you look at other people and say, hey, you're wrong, I'm right. I'm going to boldly let you know that you're wrong and I'm right.
So let's come back in just a second and let's talk about what that actually looks like in practice. So boldness can be a great thing. It's something we see in Jesus, we see in Paul, we see in all these stories. It also can be a bad thing. How do we sort through that? What does that look like in our lives?
Great question.
All right, Steve. So we're talking about what boldness looks like in practice for us today as followers of Jesus, as exiles. And I want to circle back to, what you shared about being over the mission field, shopping at the Gap, having this overwhelming sense of guilt that you didn't share the gospel with anybody while you were shopping for clothes. And, we've said that boldness is this positive thing. It's an amplifier of your faith, of your beliefs, of your values. Because I could see somebody saying, yeah, you should have been more bold. You should have been sharing the gospel. The reason you had guilt is because you were complacent. I mean, should we have that standard of boldness?
I think what I've learned over the years, is like Paul calls us to season our conversation with salt, to be aware in the moment and the opportunity. But there's a negative way to do that and a positive way. I remember years ago, this story actually made international news. This is an example of the negative side of boldness. A pilot, he had just returned Christian guy from a mission trip, was super stoked about his faith. He'd seen God do incredible things, people come to faith. He's flying a flight cross country, like a 6-hour flight. And early on in the flight, he says, I want anyone on this flight who's a Christian, who knows Jesus, to raise your hand.
He gets on the intercom.
Yep.
To the whole plane.
This is your captain speaking.
Yes.
And he says, raise your hand if you are a Christian. This all got reported later. Reporters are taking this down from people who actually lived this. So people sheepishly raised their hands. And then he says, I want all of you who raised your hands to turn to those that didn't raise their hands and tell them how to meet Jesus, because those people are crazy.
I can imagine being on that plane and hearing the captain do this and thinking this guy's going to kill us all.
Right.
He's going to crash the plane and he wants us to share the gospel so that these people go to heaven.
Unless we accept Jesus.
Yeah. So did that go well for him when he landed and had to talk to his bosses?
The people who felt coerced into having to listen to a gospel message were, horrified, offended. The people who were Christians were like, I would like to share faith because I love you, not because the captain just coerced me into it. So that did not go well. The guy did not lose his job, surprisingly. I looked this up, but he got a pretty good hand slap.
So, and to those who are hearing that and feeling like, okay, well, I get that you wouldn't want to do that, and that would be awkward or whatever, but convince me that that's not the biblical model. Maybe he really was being faithful and he's being bold and we're the ones judging him. And I would just say, actually, when we look at the stories of the boldness that we see in the Bible, and we'll go back to Daniel. Daniel was in exile for 70 something years, lived his whole life there. Most of the time, Daniel was just a good citizen of Babylon, wasn't, going against the tide, wasn't making a huge deal of why everybody else was wrong about God and why he was right. We looked at chapter 1 and Daniel and his friends, they accept pagan names given to them by Babylon, don't even fight back. They go to school to learn all of the pagan ways of Babylon and learn about all the Babylonian worship, and they excel in learning that in the history of Babylon and all that. And I could see people looking at them and going like, do you guys even have a spine? Like, speak up and say something. But there are these key moments where God opens a door, where there's a moment to stand up for what you believe in, to not compromise in any way your faithfulness to God. And those are the moments they always take. And so I think for us, it's it too. It's what are the moments where God is really giving you an opportunity to boldly proclaim Jesus, to stand up for what you believe in, to make a difference.
Yeah, we see it all wrong if we assume that every day Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego were taking these bold stands publicly, marching around Babylon with a megaphone and sandwich signs, etc. I mean, that was, like you said, as a span of 70 years, and we see these key moments where God gave them amazing opportunities. And you use that word opportunity. Paul uses that word opportunity. He says, make the most of every opportunity. Not every interaction you have with someone is a great opportunity. Yeah. I was coming back from Mexico this last week. I went down and visited one of our missionaries, and Noah Frank from my missions committee and we were taking the public transportation back to the airport. And there was these two homeless guys sitting next to us, and they were talking in what I think was a drug-induced stupor about how they are God. They're both prophets. There's the Lord, then there's the most chief Lord. I mean, these guys were waxing crazy. And, I looked at Noah and I'm like, thinking to myself, should I intervene? Should I give these guys a lesson in theology? And that wasn't the opportunity or the moment. Those guys, they weren't in a place to hear me. Was I being ashamed of the gospel? I don't think so. I was praying for those guys the whole time, but that wasn't the most opportune time to share Jesus.
Yeah, I shared a story in a sermon a few weeks ago about a moment where I was out in public, at a restaurant setting, people at tables, and I was working on my laptop, but I was overhearing another couple have a conversation about God and about, they weren't believers. They were kind of making fun of somebody who in their life who was a Christian because he was always going to church and always going to Bible study, and kind of laughing about that. And there was this moment where one of them said, I really sometimes wish it was true that God was real. And
I remember you sharing that. Yeah.
I had a couple people ask me like, why didn't you go, interrupt them and share the gospel with them? And I get that. Again, like I really don't think I was being ashamed of the gospel at all. It's just, that is culturally a very strange thing to do, to walk to another table in a restaurant and interrupt somebody's private conversation and like try to sit down and start a conversation or relationship with them. Like I don't think that was an opportunity for me in that. And this is one of the things where I think it's important for us to understand that we're bold because we love Jesus. We want to be used by him in the kingdom. It's out of worship to him.
Right.
It is not because we think that without our intervention, all hope is lost for other people. We have to trust other people's spiritual lives and salvation to God, and take every opportunity he gives us, but not think that somebody else's eternal destiny is hanging in the balance based on my decision of whether or not I'm going to share the gospel with them or not.
And there's some real subtleties there, like if I'm afraid I'm going to offend somebody, that's one thing. So if I choose not to speak up and I have an opportunity just because I'm afraid I'll offend, that's not bold. But we almost flip that around to, well, you should offend people all the time. Boldness is being willing to offend. Or like we equate boldness, this is true in the culture too. Boldness is just, I don't care what anybody thinks. Well, I do care about people's feelings. I care what they think. I'm not going to let that get in the way of declaring that Jesus is God and that my allegiance is with him.
There's a difference between being willing to offend and wanting to offend.
Exactly right.
And I mean, that's like where we see Daniel walk that line perfectly. He is so respectful to all the kings. He says, "O king, may you live forever," a handful of times in this book. He's never rubbing anybody's face in anything. I mean, he's being respectful, he's being loving, but he's also going to say the truth, and he's going to not give in to the pressure to bow to the idols. And he's, so there is that that line that you have to walk. So there's some things it doesn't look like. I'm not a big fan of giving people fake $100 bills that are actually a gospel tract.
I remember those.
I feel like disappointing somebody that they didn't just find $100 is not the best intro to sharing Jesus with them. But I know many people who have done that and had some success. God uses all kinds of things. I mean, Steve, what do you think it looks like practically for a follower of Jesus who's going to Alderwood right now or in another church somewhere? I want to be bold. I want to not be ashamed of the gospel. I want to be willing to step up and stand out if it means being a part of what Jesus is calling me to do. What are some ways that you think that actually looks like in practice?
Well, I love this passage that we read from Colossians 4. I mean, we could just spend so much time on it, but like we said, it echoes another passage in Ephesians where Paul asks that they pray for him to have boldness, but to just if you want to say it, rank and file Colossian believers, just like you and me. Yeah. He's offering things that go along with boldness: prayerfulness, watchfulness, gratitude, making the most of opportunities, having your conversation be seasoned with salt. There's a place in Acts where the Greek scholars tell us that the best translation of what is being stated there, it's right after the Christians get dispersed from Jerusalem from the persecution. It says they went and they gossiped the gospel. They just couldn't stop talking about it. It just naturally came off their lips. It was the hot topic, And I don't think like we always have to have some hokey intro line. Years ago, Holly and I were working in an inner city ministry, and these homeless people we were working with, these young teens, they started talking about drugs, and one of the guys we were with goes, "You want a real high? You need to know Jesus." And everybody, teens and the Christians, just broke out laughing like, dude, that's the lamest thing I've ever heard in my life. I don't think that's the best intro or what it means to season your conversation with salt, but just looking for opportunities when the Holy Spirit is moving, you sense that, and you have the courage to just say, hey, can I talk to you about Jesus?
And I will say this. I mean, I want to make sure we're not demeaning too much just people who say the cheesy line or whatever. Because you know what? I'll take a Christian who's willing to put themselves out there and says something cheesy or lame over the Christian who never speaks up ever about their faith. I mean, avoids those opportunities like the plague. And I think some of us are there. I mean, it's one thing to say, wait for an opportunity. It's another thing to say, do you want God to give you an opportunity to share the gospel? Or are you intentionally trying to get out of any position that would ever put you in a spot where you have to talk about your faith?
It's a great question.
I think that's one of the places I would really encourage people to start is make it part of your daily time with the Lord to ask the Holy Spirit to give you an opportunity today. God, would you help me? Show me a door, bring somebody into my life, have a conversation that I can lead into a spiritual conversation where I can ask somebody how they're really doing, where I can ask them what they think about, their relationship with God or who Jesus is. And I, time and time again, have been blown away at how quickly God answers that prayer.
It's a great prayer. I heard somebody years ago say this statement, and it stuck to me because, like I said, I get a little timid, a little bit intimidated by people, especially in the middle of a awkward or conflict-filled conversation. And, someone said, you might be nervous to talk to other people about Jesus, but you should never be nervous to talk to Jesus about other people. And my neighbors that I can easily talk to about the weather or the Seahawks or how nice their lawn looks, I start to get a little awkward sometimes when it might turn to spiritual things. But man, if I'm relying on my own strength, if I'm trying to create the opportunities, generally it's not going to go anywhere. But man, the Lord loves to open those doors for us.
Yeah. Just to keep kind of getting practical on what this looks like, one of the things that I've tried to do with my neighbors and with other people in my life that maybe I don't know where they're at spiritually, or I know that they're not a follower of Jesus, is as we're talking and just sharing life with each other, as they share things going on that are difficult or hard or something that they have some amount of anxiety or fear about, I'll just ask them if I can pray for them. And I don't mean saying, I will pray for you about that, then walking away. I mean, can I pray for you right now? And praying for them. And I have only one time ever had somebody say no. And maybe that's because they feel awkward or whatever. I'm not sure. But either way, just to be able to pray in Jesus' name for whatever they are talking about. And then I walk away, you know, I don't go for the close and, you know, try to convince them to become a Christian right then. But that has been something that God has used time and time again to allow us to have a conversation at a deeper level than just the superficial stuff going on. And, you know, and this is, again, for me, I'm going to leave it in God's hands what he does with that. You know, that neighbor ever wants to talk to me again, or, you know, then avoids me, which happens sometimes too, you know, but at least they know that I know Jesus, that I love them, that I want to pray for them. I want to care what's going on in their life. And often there's been a new level of relationship that's happened out of that.
Yeah, that is a great way. I think praying for people, there's almost always an openness. I had that with a few of my neighbors over the years, and that led to opportunities to do weddings for their kids, you know, and I know not everybody like you and me as a pastor that's going to get those moments, but you just never know where that's going to lead. Or when somebody has a crisis. I had another neighbor who, you know, had a really deep marital crisis, knew I was a Christian and hadn't talked to me for years, and shows up at my doorstep, you know, so you never quite know what God's going to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's talk about one other practical issue, which is, you know, when it takes boldness to stand up for what you believe is true about the world, because you believe the Bible, you believe what Jesus says, and you know that is going to go against the grain of the people that you're around. So I'm talking about, you know, issues around sexuality is maybe one of the hottest ones in our culture right now. I mean,
huge,
you know, a lot of people listening to this will be working at companies that require that you put your gender pronouns in your email signature, that, you know, very boldly celebrate Pride Month every year in June. And, you know, everybody will, you know, have rainbow flags on their profile pictures, and, you know, and so, you know, that's the expectation of the world around you. And you're somebody who believes in the Orthodox Christian view of sexuality, that God created gender, he created man and woman. It's good. He created marriage to be a lifelong commitment between a man and a woman. And you love your coworkers. You love the people in your office. You're not trying to, you know, condemn anybody. You're not trying to start an argument. But that moment comes when you kind of get pinned down, you know, somebody in your office turns to you and says, "Hey, did you hear Tom got engaged to his boyfriend? How awesome is that? Aren't you excited for him?" And then you have that moment of like, what do you say to that? I mean, Steve, how do you think through some of those really tough issues? I mean, we're maybe like the worst people to give advice to this because we both work at a church, but
that hasn't happened on staff recently.
No, not yet. But if you're in that situation, and we pastor plenty of people who are in those situations, I mean, what are some tips you might give somebody?
Oh man, that scenario you just painted, that has got to be one of the most difficult ones I could imagine.
I mean, it happened to me. I not in the church office, but at college in a class. You know, somebody in our university had just come out as gay, and there was this group of people who were just like, "Isn't that awesome? Isn't that great?" And yeah, I mean, to be honest, and what I did in that exact situation was I just kind of looked blankly and thought, and, you know, said, oh, you know, like some kind of just meaningless noise.
Well, that was my first response too. Oh, wow. Yeah, man. And the work, I mean, you know, I hadn't worked much of my life outside of the church, but I've worked some, and I was in some situations that were awkward, never quite that awkward. When I think of that one, man, the first thing that comes to my mind is that my coworkers would already know I'm a believer in some way, shape, or form, you know, and more than just because I have a cross on my desk or I have my Bible out. Not that there's anything wrong with those things, but hopefully I've had the opportunity verbally to share it. And then secondly, I would hope that my coworkers knew I genuinely cared about them as human beings. I had taken an interest in them and listened to them and enjoyed their company. So I think if you have those things in place, it does change the starting point for the conversation. But man, it would still be a tough one, because if you jump out and say, "Oh yeah, that is terrific," then of course you run the risk of that person assuming that, you know, you believe everything they believe. But if you say that's all
because that's what you just said.
That's what you just said. What a crazy thought. But if you say, well, that horrible sinner, I mean, he needs to know that God, you know.
Yeah.
And so that's not going to go well either.
There's a bold response that's an angry response. There's the willingness to be persecuted because you say, you know what, I don't think that's great for Tom because I'm a Christian and I believe the Bible and he's gonna go to hell if he continues in this lifestyle that he's living. I mean, that's bold. I don't think it's very loving. I don't think it's very gracious. I don't think it's going to get you very far in representing Jesus in your company. So I mean, that's where we need to remember boldness purely is not always a good thing
on its own. Yeah.
But you brought up a really important point. There is this reaction to just say what people expect you to say, to just go, yeah, that's great, even if you don't believe it. And that to me is what I think we want to make sure we avoid. We don't want to be dishonest. When we look at Jesus' example, he hung out with sinners all the time. They felt comfortable with him. He felt no responsibility to make sure that everybody knew that he disagreed with the choices of the people that he was hanging out with. There was none of that. He just loved people in an unqualified way. And because of that, he did get accused of being a drunkard, of being a glutton. I mean, he was not popular for hanging out with prostitutes and tax collectors. People assumed he approved of what they did because he hung out with them. That didn't bother him. But what he didn't do was agree with the sin of what they were doing. He didn't lie and say, everything's fine. He spoke the truth and he loved them. And that is a difficult thing to do, but I think that it has to be our goal in how we handle this kind of conversations.
I'm stuck on that situation. Like I can't stop. I'll be thinking about that for a while because what if that person turns to you and, you just, what if you did have some sort of half lame answer like, oh, I didn't know. But why aren't you excited? This is amazing. I mean, at some point, if you get pinned down, you're going to have to say something.
I mean, I think right now, there's what we say we would do and there's what we'd actually do.
For sure.
I don't know what I would actually do. That's a tough situation. What I would try to do is I would try to say some positive things about Tom. I'd try to say, I love Tom so much, man, I'm excited to see, I'm excited to talk to him and share, this moment with him or whatever. I would try to say something positive without committing myself to a position.
Yeah. Your lead isn't going to be negative or condemning.
Right. But then, I expect that somebody is going to be able to tell that I'm not sharing the same level of enthusiasm that they are. And I would be prepared for that person to ask me, what I think or why or whatever. And I think that is part of being bold, is being willing to have the conversation.
Yeah, I'd like to think I'd say something along the lines of what you said. Man, Tom and I are friends. I want Tom to be really happy. Then why aren't you happy? Well, as a Christian, I don't think that's God's best for Tom. And that is not what I believe God intends for marriage. But I really care about Tom.
I love him.
He's a friend of mine, and I'm gonna go talk to him.
Yeah, and then you're probably gonna get canceled. And
probably.
And that's the deal. Like Daniel gets thrown to the lion's den. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego get thrown to the furnace. I think that's the other piece, is that God doesn't necessarily need you to be loved by everybody to use your life in an effective way. You have to leave the outcome of what happens to God, and you have to be faithful. And what the consequences are, God can handle that. He can figure it out.
And quick aside on that, if someone's listening and they can maybe relate to me, I feel like I'm the slowest thinker in the world. I feel like I just kind of shrivel when things get awkward, and I don't always like those situations. But one thing I really have become convinced and convicted of is I don't have to be clever. I think an honest, even if it's a fumbling, an honest and sincere answer that honors God is actually going to carry more weight than a clever, witty answer. So I'm okay with that. I'm learning to be more okay with that. God's going to take care of what's going on in that person's heart.
It's a good word. Well, somebody out there's listening, and they have the perfect response for Tom. So if you have that, you can send it to us.
I can't wait.
Toby will put the email address in the show notes. But Steve, as we wrap this conversation up, where do you want to leave people?
I just want to encourage people to be boldly loving and humble. It's like you said, it's an amplifier. And so, Peter we've talked about this verse so much, always be prepared to give the reason for the hope that you have. Paul saying, make the most of every conversation. When you get that opportunity, be bold, but be boldly loving, be boldly gracious, be boldly humble, and speak the truth in love and leave the rest in God's hands.
Yeah, it's a good word. Thanks, Steve.
want to boldly thank you for joining us again on Native Exiles. I hope we've encouraged you to be both bold and humble because of the gospel. And we're just so appreciative that you continue to follow us, subscribe to the podcast. Look forward to seeing you next time on Native Exiles.